Today is August 2nd, 2006. We're doing an oral history interview. I'm Charles Lundquist, and our interviewee today is Fletcher Kurtz. Fletcher, thank you for coming.
Glad to be here.
Could you start out by telling us a little bit about where you spent your youth, and where you got educated, and how you got into the space program?
Okay, I was born in Macon, Georgia. My father was a chemistry professor at Mercer at the time. He ended up starting the chemistry department later at what's now Georgia State University. And I went to, grew up there in outside of Atlanta, and went to Vanderbilt, and graduated in 56, and my wife graduated in 57, and in physics, had a master's in physics, and we went off to Panama City for the summer, and then off to University of California at Berkeley, and that was at the height of the hippies out there. And
that was fun, I'll bet.
The draft board was breathing down my neck, and so I left and came to the Army Ballistic Missile Agency.
So what year was that?
1958. April. I came on my birthday, April 1st, 1958.
Just after the first satellite.
Just after the first satellite, yeah. And went to work for Fred Spear, then Fridtjof Spear.
Yes.
He later became Fred, and I walked in out of graduate school not knowing what to expect, and he handed me a report on the physics of spinning clusters and a bunch of data, and said, "Go figure out what to do with it." And so I learned some more physics and some math.
The spinning cluster, of course, was from the
Juno vehicle, the Juno, on the upper stage of the stages of the Juno vehicles. And from there we started doing early orbit determination on the Junos and least squares, and then as the Apollo program started up, Fred became head of the Mission Operations Office, and I left. I was in the Aeroballistics Laboratory originally, and we left Aeroballistics and went to the Mission Ops Office, where we were during the Saturn Apollo programs, and then Fred moved on to the HEO program, High Energy Astronomical Observatories. Astrophysical Observatory. I couldn't remember it coming in.
Astrophysical.
And then I took over the Mission Operations Office, where I remained until...
What year was that then?
That was about in the early 70s. I don't remember, 70, probably 71, 72 in there. And then after Skylab, I stayed there until after Skylab. After Skylab, there was a reorganization of the center, and the old Mission Operations Office was abolished, and my people and I moved, most of us, to Systems Analysis and Integration Lab, where we started working on Spacelab. And that led to eventually to the Spacelab Payload Operations Control Center, and from there to the International Space Station Payload Operations Integration Center at Marshall.
Now, that's a quick survey of your career. Let's go back to Skylab. Tell me a little bit about the operations you were involved in during Skylab.
Well, that was kind of a disaster recovery, as everybody knows, but leading up to Skylab, one of the things that I was involved with from the inception was the Huntsville Operations Support Center, which was a facility where the engineers and management of Marshall gathered during launches to support both the Cape and the Mission Control Center in Houston.
When was that first established, or when did its roots start?
Well, the roots of it were 1960, when Kennedy Space Center was being spun off from Marshall. And Dr. von Braun and Dr. Debus wanted to maintain a tie between the engineers in Huntsville and the engineers at the Cape. And so they established what was called Project LEAF then, Launch Information Exchange Facility, to maintain those communications. And the Huntsville Operations Support Center was the place where people gathered in Huntsville. And we provided engineering support all the way through Saturn and Apollo. When Skylab came along, the mode on Apollo was that the engineers, and I mean hundreds of them, gathered in the HOSC for each launch. But for Skylab, which was going to last for 9 months, no one wanted to stay over there that long. So the idea was that we would provide the data, and the engineers would come in and look at the data, and then they'd go back to their offices and do their normal business. And so that was the plan, and it's a little bit like buying the HOSC was a little bit like buying an insurance policy. How much insurance do you want against something happening? And the prevailing wisdom was, well, we don't need a whole heck of a lot. But then came the launch, and all of a sudden we hadn't bought enough insurance. And people, we were suddenly thrown into a 24/7 mode of operations where engineers had to be there around the clock in order to do the analysis of the conditions of Skylab on orbit and figure out what to do in order to keep it alive.
See, the HOSC was in the Comp Lab building, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. It's in Building 4663. Started in a little conference room on the second floor of M Wing that Dr. Holzer, director of Comp Lab, let us use. And then it gradually grew till today it occupies all of A and B Wing. It was kind of from the standpoint of Comp Lab, I think it was kind of a cancer.
The tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, that they viewed it that way for a period of years. But
how did you interact with the experiments on Skylab and the experimenters?
Well, most of the science support on Skylab was down at Houston at the MCC, and so the folks in Huntsville, other than the scientists themselves, weren't too involved in the HOSC. There was some support from there, but it was mostly engineering support, right? But the Skylab experience on science led to a different concept for Spacelab, because on Skylab, which was the Apollo applications program, it was extending what was done on Apollo to an on-orbit space station. The mode was that the Mission Control Center ran everything in flight, and it was largely an engineering operation, caring for the astronauts and bringing them back safely. And the science was kind of an add-on, and the scientist spoke to the Houston flight controllers who in the back room, who spoke to the Houston flight controllers in the front room, who spoke to the crew communicator, who spoke to the crew. And so there was kind of a long chain there in conducting science. And the scientists, I think, to some degree felt like illegal immigrants in today's terminology. In the MCC, at least they some of them expressed that. There were some pioneering things done. Owen Garriott speaks very proudly that he was the first astronaut to speak directly to a scientist on the ground during the Skylab mission, when there was a a problem with some particular instrument, and he insisted on speaking directly to the PI, and there was a conversation took place. But when Spacelab came along, Spacelab was designed as a scientific laboratory on orbit, and so the operations were modified also to involve the scientists much more directly. And I think that's one of the accomplishments I'm proud of in the development of mission operations at Marshall was the evolution of science operations, where the scientists on the ground could now directly command their instruments on board without having to have someone do it for them, and they can see their data in real time, and they can talk to the crew when they need to directly. So that evolved during Spacelab and then was carried over into the space station.
Before we get to space station, let's digress a minute. I know the HOSC was very involved in the reentry of Skylab and the reprogramming of the...
Well, yeah, they actually didn't use the HOSC for that.
Oh, really?
No, the HOSC was mothballed after Skylab.
Oh, I see.
Or after ASTP. We flew one more, the last Saturn 1B mission, the Apollo-Soyuz test project, in 1975, I believe. And
Did
then
you have any interactions with the Russians during that?
we didn't. We just supported the Saturn 1B, and as soon as the Apollo command module was in orbit, CSM was in orbit, we shut down.
Okay.
And the HOSC was mothballed and for about 3 or 4 years until it was restarted for the shuttle program. But in that 3 or 4 years was the time period when, of course, they had planned to send a shuttle up and rescue the Skylab, but the shuttle program kept slipping and the Skylab orbit kept decaying, and so finally they decided simply to try to re-enter it. And Herman Thomason, who was director of the Systems Analysis and Integration Lab at that time, organized a team to do that, and they did it actually out of the conference room in Sailab.
Oh, okay. So they didn't come over to the HOSC?
Did not come to the HOSC. No, I
didn't remember that.
I served as an advisor, and helping them set it up to some extent, but it was a ad hoc operation, small operation, actually out of the conference room, and a phone line to the folks in the Mission Control Center who still sent the commands to the Skylab.
All right. Well, let's go on to the space station then.
Okay. Well, let me talk a little bit more about Spacelab.
Please.
Maybe first, because
please do.
It kind of leads to the space station concept. On Spacelab, as I said, it was intended to be an on-orbit laboratory, and there was a debate early on about man doing all the science, and the big push everybody wanted was to be able to send scientists up there and let them operate in a shirt sleeve environment as if they were in their laboratory at home. And initially there wasn't much thought to teleoperations by command from the ground. But as the payloads got to be defined, it turned out that the crew couldn't do as much as they wanted them, as the scientists wanted them to do it, and so there were a lot of experiments that came in requiring commanding. Another unique thing on Spacelab at that time was the 50 megabit per second downlink, which was an unheard of amount of data to be bringing to the ground, and the technology at that time didn't quite know what to do with it. Once it got on the ground, the storage. Today it's nothing, but then it was tough. So there evolved a mode on Spacelab where the scientists could bring their ground support equipment, their computers and their analysis tools into the Payload Operations Control Center and plug it into the data system and plug it into the command system and communicate. Now that was kind of a first. And then they could interact through the NASA cadre personnel through the Mission Control Center in Houston with the orbit. We also built the PCTC, the Payload Crew Training Center, which was one of those entrepreneurial exercises that took place in Marshall. There was a lot of that in the Spacelab program, but they didn't have much money initially, and that's one of the things that I wonder how much of that spirit still resides out there today. But when we started working on Spacelab, the Europeans, of course, were building it, and it was the first time that there was going to be a computer that the crew would operate experiments through the computer, and they would have data displays that they could look at, and so no one quite knew how to design those displays. It was a much increased capability over what the crew had in the Apollo command module, and even beyond what the orbiter provided the crew at that time. But the program was budget limited, and so when we came to designing those displays, it started with a co-op who said, "Gee, I'd like to help design the displays. What should they look like?" And we couldn't afford. There were only two. NASA was only buying two of the actual flight displays. They were so expensive. One was going to Houston and one was going to the software development facility at Marshall. So we found some little outfit in Huntsville that could build a mock-up of the display and a tube that we could make look like the display. And that grew as the displays were designed on it into the idea, well, we ought to have a simulator that looks like the computer works. And then the manned systems people were building some mock-ups to figure out how to arrange things, and so the idea was, well, let's make the mock-up look a little more like the Spacelab, and let's put the display in it, and so it grew into a training facility that was used to train all of the Spacelab crews. And but there was no budget. There was never any budget for it until it was in operation. It was in operation, but it was something that was needed and that we were able to do. And the Haas, came along pretty much the same way, and with the original Spacelab Control Center was in Houston, but it was very limited in capability. And as the Spacelab payloads were defined and the requirements grew, Marshall was approved to have its own POC, which was intended to be to complement the JSC POC, but we were going to operate on Astro 1 for the first flight, and that was the first flight scheduled after Challenger. And so when the Challenger accident occurred, there was another flight gap of a couple of years, and in that time frame they decided to do away with the JSC POC and fly all of the missions out of Spacelab missions out of Marshall. But another pioneering thing that we did in that POC was developed a data system that was now mini-computer based as opposed to central processor based as the Mission Control Center and the HOSC systems originally were. And so it was a distributed processing system, which again allowed the scientists to plug into it and eventually to remote. So by the end of Spacelab, we had started remoting data to the scientists at the universities and their home sites.
How were the HOSC and the POC related?
The POC was in the HOSC.
Was in the HOSC, okay.
Yeah, the HOSC has always been the umbrella name for the facility, which contained at that peak of the program a shuttle support center, engineering support center, the Spacelab Payload Operations Control Center, but it also provided engineering support to the IUS flights, to Hubble launch and activation, and to some other payloads that came along. So it was really a multi-project facility, and the POC was eventually the largest, but a tenant in the HOSC. So in that time frame, actually the space station was conceived before we started flying all the Spacelab missions. We had flown a few, but the Spacelab program definition occurred before we had really flown all the flights, and so there was a space station operations task force at the beginning with representation from all the centers to figure out how to operate the space station. And the task force blessed an extension of the Spacelab concept, the concepts that we had developed during Spacelab.
That concept included a European involvement, didn't it?
Well, the Europeans were involved on Spacelab very much.
Didn't they have their own operation
They
somewhere?
had their own control center, and they flew a couple of European missions out of that control center in Darmstadt, Germany. But they also operated experiments on almost every U.S. Spacelab flight, through the POC and came over. There was one Japanese, Spacelab J was a Japanese mission, which introduced some interesting cultural differences in the science operations, payload operations. But for space station, which was conceived as an international operation, now there is still to be someday a European control center for all of the Columbus module and their experiments, and for the Japanese also plan to have one for the Japanese excursion module on the space station.
Well, as the space station was being planned, there was use of some Russian facilities jointly as a precursor to space station. Were you involved in that?
The Mir flights. No, that occurred actually after I left NASA. I left in '90, and I think the Mir flights came later. But the HOSC was not involved in those because it was other than just support to the shuttle launches. But on space station, the Ops Task Force established that there should be a payload operations integration center to coordinate the international science operations, separate from the Mission Control Center, and that assignment was given to Marshall because of the Spacelab POC responsibilities and the expertise in that the Marshall folks had developed in that. And the Houston people have always focused on, as they should, on the safety of the vehicle and the health and well-being of the crew. And the Marshall folks, what evolved after Skylab and during the Spacelab years was a focus on caring for the scientists, on facilitating and being responsive and really taking care of the science. And so those are the two roles that have played out in Space Station. Unfortunately, because of the delays and difficulties in Space Station, both budget and launch rate related, the scientific promise has not yet been realized, but maybe it will be. Hope it will be. But the POIC is still operating 24/7.
And what is its main function right now then?
Well, there is science being conducted on the station. It's limited to life sciences now, pretty much, and but that's still coordinated through the POIC. There is a quantity of payload support equipment and experiment equipment on the space station which the POIC operates. The
glove box and some things like that.
Glove box. There's a life sciences rack. There's a material processing racks, which I don't know how much they're being used, but they're still there, and so they still have to monitor them. But there's data recorders that capture the onboard data and then pipe it back to ground over 50 megabits. They measure, they manage that. There's some other, I can't recall off the top of my head now, but there's some other, quite a bit of payload equipment, payload support equipment that the POIC operates.
For the HOSC, I know you were involved in the production of a DVD that outlines the history of the HOSC. Can you say a few words about how that came about?
Well, when I came to work at Marshall in April of '58, there was a young lady who came to work for Fred Spear shortly after that. She graduated in June and came to work, and we actually then evolved into a section and grew from there. But a young lady named Ann McNair, and Ann Richardson she was then, and then Ann McNair, and she's still out there. She now is director of the Mission Ops Lab, and still working. And she realized that she had a lot of young folks who didn't know the history. They were working in the HOSC, they're manning consoles around the clock, but they didn't really know how it came to be and why some things were the way they were. And I think the center has had a similar perception that they need to remind people of the heritage. And so she asked me if I would help the Photolab people in creating a video history of the HOSC. And so we did, with a lot of pictures. I had an archive of photographs from the early years, and so with those photographs and some interviews that the Photolabs people made with a number of the astronauts who remembered the HOSC and the support they got during Apollo and Skylab and Spacelab, they put together put together the video history.
It's a very nice job, incidentally. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I think it came off fairly well, and it's the Photolab people think that it's the most complete history kind of thing that Marshall has done. I mean, they have other, obviously other products, but nothing that really goes into the history as much as that one.
Okay.
And it's been pretty well received out there, according to Dan.
So where were you when you retired? What were you? You were running the hospital?
If we go back after the reorganization in 1975, some of our people in the Mission Operations Office went off to Data Systems Lab, which was a new experiment, and the others of us went to the Operations Development Division in Sailab. And as the years passed, Data Systems Lab was not the success they wanted it to be, I guess, and so it was abolished, and the operations people in that lab came back to Sailab, and then in 1990,
SAIL stands for what?
Systems Analysis and Integration Laboratory. And so in 1980, I was a division chief. I moved up to a deputy lab director in Sailab. And in 1990, the Sailab was split into, or the Mission Operations Laboratory was split off from Sailab. Sailab remained, but the Mission Operations part of it, which included the manned systems and the mission analysis, mission planning division, were split off from the Mission Operations Laboratory, and I was director of that in setting it up, and the first year of operation of that laboratory for the first year of operation, and then I left NASA.
So you retired when?
1990, October 1990.
What have you been doing since then?
Well, I wound up working for a small company, a small business it was then, but it grew into a large business and was sold to a gigantic business. But I was in a group that wound up doing supercomputing.
Oh.
And so we operated two of the Department of Defense has what's called major shared resource centers for supercomputing. And we operated two of those centers, the one in Vicksburg, Mississippi, Corps of Engineers, and the Aeronautical Systems Center in Dayton, Ohio. And then subsequently, we also operated the supercomputers for Ames Research Center in NASA and for the Goddard Space Flight Center.
So you've been busy then?
Yes, yeah, it was an interesting time, but not as interesting as the NASA years.
Are you still working then?
That was a fun ride.
Still working for them or not?
A little bit.
A little bit.
A little bit. Yeah.
Let me come back to Spacelab. Were you around during the tether experiments?
No, I had left. I was there during the planning for it, but the operation of it came after.
Came after you left.
I left in.
I didn't remember the exact timing of that.
Yeah, after Challenger, after the return to flight, which was in probably 87 or thereabouts, the manifest was shuffled because of the hiatus and the priority of different payloads, and NASA was still flying DoD payloads at that point, which had priority, and the Hubble had priority, and so the Spacelab missions were moved down the manifest until they worked through the backlog of the other missions. And so I was there for the launch of Hubble, and a number of other missions. That was the highlight, I guess, after return to flight. And then I left shortly before they flew Astro 1 out of the pod.
Do you have any thoughts you'd like to put on the record for the new people who are undertaking challenging jobs out at Marshall and in NASA in general?
Well, I think the challenge, as I alluded to earlier, maybe is to be entrepreneurial, and we did a lot of things in the early days which were successful in spite of lack of budget, and in some cases maybe even lack of authority.
Entrepreneurial, as you said.
Entrepreneurial, but we did them because it was interesting, it was challenging, it was interesting, and we could see something that we could do, and so we focused on doing those things. Some of the projects, I think, and the space station is a good example, in my opinion, of a project that was conceived on too grandiose a scale initially, and NASA wasn't able to carry through with the original concept. And so there's something to be said for keeping it simple and doing what you can do, and not overreaching.
Well, that's probably a good thought to leave with the next generation of space people. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate you coming.